why don't we get started and introduce ourselves. My name is Laura Kells, and I'm an archivist in the Manuscript Division's preparation section.
And my name is Meg McAleer, and I'm a colleague of Laura's. I'm, like Laura, I'm a processing archivist. So just a shout out, how many other archivists do we have in the audience? Okay, good, quite a few. That's wonderful. And how many are not archivists and suddenly find yourselves responsible for an archival collection? Okay.
Great.
We gotta talk.
As Meg said, we're processing archivists, and that means that we get collections in their raw state as they come from the donor, and we arrange and describe them to make them usable by researchers. And we want to welcome you to our session on manuscript processing, but actually it's just an aspect of manuscript processing and our experiences with the truth about original order, or how to proceed when your collection arrives in trash cans.
Which
happened to me.
Okay, we all know the importance of original order, of maintaining records in the way that they were created, maintained, and used by the record creators. This is one of the basic fundamental principles of archival management. But those of us who, particularly who process personal papers, kind of struggle with what this means when your collection does arrive in a trash can. And I think for a lot of us, I think it's fairly typical, we tend to get a collection at the end of someone's career or at the end of their life. And you get them in very much as-is condition. Forget about a records management program where you've been able to influence any of this. And then on top of it is we have this kind of new challenge in the profession, and that is more product, less process approach. How many of you are familiar with this article? Okay, a few of you. It was published in American Archivist in 2005 by Mark Green and Dennis Meisner. And it's totally transformed how archivists are approaching processing. So for those of you who haven't read it, let me just kind of run through the argument. Green and Meisner were very concerned about the incredible volume of unprocessed collections in repository backlogs. Collections that are not available for researchers to use. And their solution was to advocate archivists greatly streamlining processing, not being quite so fussy in how we process collections, so that you move them much more quickly from your backlog and into your reading room. And there's a lot of merit to this, and I think particularly when so many of us are dealing with budget constraints. This makes a lot of sense. So here's a scenario that's presented in the article. A collection arrives in your repository. It's in file cabinets. You open the top drawer. You take out some of the files. You put them into a box. You don't refolder. You don't look for duplicates. You don't look for conservation problems. You don't weed for extraneous material. You merely write down the title of the folder as it exists, creating a box list. You put a label on the side of that box, and it's ready to serve. And again, this has so much merit. But I have to tell you what our reaction was to that article and to that scenario. There are actually collections out there stored in file cabinets. And not only that, the material is in folders. And unbelievably, some of those folders have meaningful titles. Just too good to be true.
Because certainly papers come to us from offices, but others have spent years in warehouses or stashed in somebody's basement closet or down in a damp basement in an attic or a barn, or even in one case that I know about, stashed under a front porch. And while papers certainly come to us in record center cartons or file cabinets, others are in plastic bags, candy boxes, liquor boxes. This is a hotel laundry bag inside of a Bergdorf Goodman dress box. It comes in trunks and suitcases, and this is a tote bag that says condolence letters. I don't think you can read that.
It's for the ultimate voyage.
And yes, trash cans.
We like to talk about the horror stories, but I think for us, and probably for you, the typical collection is probably somewhat of a mixed bag in terms of arrangement. You'll have parts of it that are actually pretty well arranged. And then there are other parts of it where you kind of can figure out what had been the intended arrangement that at some point fell apart. And then other parts of the collection have absolutely no arrangement at all. So what we thought we would do is share some personal reflections about how we handle such collections. And during the Q&A, those of you who are archivists, we'd love to hear your experiences. But there also, I think, are maybe some new people to archival work. And you may be staring at an absolute mess of a collection, and you're paralyzed.
Well, we had, when Meg and I gave this presentation several years ago, one of the attendees came up to us and told us how much we helped him, and he liked hearing about what we had to say because where he worked, they had received a really large collection, but no one knew how to deal with really large collections. So they had just put a sign up on it that said, "Do not touch." But after he heard our discussion about some of the things that we've had to deal with and what we deal with, he thought that maybe when he got back, he might be able to take the sign down and actually get going. So where do we start? We start with biographical and historical research because we benefit from the fact that a collection isn't a random grouping of items. It was created and used in a specific context, the life and activities and career of a person or the activities of an organization. And the arrangement should somehow reflect this context.
So I know for myself, when I'm doing this background research, I'm really trying to go for two things. One, I want to know why the person is noteworthy. Why did we want the collection in the first place? What were their major accomplishments? Then secondly, I want to become familiar with the basic contours of their life and their career. I almost think about it as architectural scaffolding, so kind of the broad outlines. I don't really, at this point, need to get into the weeds. What I'm trying to do is kind of get the big picture, again, that's going to help me identify the original order. Hopefully there is one.
And there's a variety of sources for this information. In personal papers, if the person was or is famous, well, then there's going to be published material that can help you with the facts that you need. Things like biographical directories or biographies or obituaries or even Wikipedia. But if a person wasn't famous, there still should be unpublished material right in the collection that is a big help. Things like resumes or job applications, military records, or oral history interviews, things like that. And if we find those things in a collection as we're poking around, we make copies for ourselves for a file, and we keep the material put it back right where we found it, at least for the time being. And it's really helpful if you can to find resumes from all kinds of points in a person's career. I think it's true for most people, it's certainly true for me, that as you get more established in your career, you drop off early activities on your later resumes. But you may very well find, we very well find files from those early activities that aren't on later resumes as we're going through.
In addition to personal papers, we also collect some organizational records. And I had the opportunity a couple years ago to do an addition to the records of the NAACP. And obviously, organizational histories were fantastic. I'm actually particularly fond of organizational charts. It gives me a really wonderful visual representation for how the organization is organized. Staff lists are great. You know, you'll get boxes labeled Joe's files, and it really helps to know that Joe was general counsel for the organization. Annual reports are an absolute godsend. There are a lot of pretty short-lived projects that never make it to the official history, but they have to be accounted for in the annual report. And as Laura said, which I thought was a really good point, we try to collect this for the whole time span of the records. Because obviously the organization changes, staff come and go, projects are picked up and dropped. So I try to make sure I get them all.
For family papers, if they're available, genealogies and family trees are really helpful. And if there are none, as we go through the collection and we learn things, we often make family trees. Because knowledge about the various peoples, their names, their nicknames, their birth dates and death dates, and the relationships among the various family members is really helpful to know. I processed the papers of the actor Vincent Price, and in his family there were 3 different Vincents, and everybody had nicknames. Turned out Bink was our Vincent. And so when we were working on the family papers, I ended up making a list of the various people's names and their nicknames. And so we found letters that had no signature at all, just a lipstick kiss. And that turned out to be from Coral Brown, who was his 3rd wife. And so on my list, I had things like Bink equals Vincent Price, hat equals his sister Harriet, and lipstick kiss equals Coral Brown.
When I'm doing background research, I really try to discipline myself not to spend too much time doing it, because it can be a really comfortable place to stay and avoid ever dealing with that collection that's sitting over there. So I really try to discipline myself to keep it focused, keep it short. And again, the 2 things I'm looking for are the major accomplishments and the scaffolding of someone's life and career. I find that once I'm processing, I have a host of really specific questions related to the material I'm finding. And what I do is I dive into that biographical file that I assembled early on to find the answers. But I really don't need to know those details early on.
During this phase, we also need to gather information about the collection itself. This is information that we find in accession records, deeds of gift, or donor correspondence, things that we keep in a case file on each collection. The kind of information we want to know is when and how the collection was acquired, the size of the collection, how many boxes are you supposed to have, the scope of the collection, and are there any problems that they know of right away? Are there restrictions? Are there special procedures for dealing with things you don't want to keep? Do they know of any odd conservation problems? Is there a lot of foreign language material? Or increasingly, are there electronic records? These are things that kind of are helpful to know right at the start. And although we don't get them very often, inventories and box lists are really helpful. And I thought I'd show you an odd kind of box list I got in the Vincent Price papers, where he wrote, "Thought this box might be fun. It's about a half a year's accumulation of miscellany, the story of my life." But it didn't turn out to be all that much fun, because in this box, there was junk mail and like credit card applications, all mixed in with correspondence and scripts and other material that really had a home elsewhere in the collection. And so how useful is it going to be for the researchers to have this specific stuff stuffed in one box? So in the end, I ended up filing most of it back where it belonged, and I didn't keep a lot of the junk mail.
What I like about this part of our work, the beginning phases, is that it really keeps my focus as an archivist where it needs to be. And that is at the highest level, the collection level. And I think that this is what really distinguishes us as archivists, maybe from librarians, is that we always think in the aggregate. We always think first on the collection level. And then only then do we begin to break that down into series, into file groupings, and eventually we get down to the folder and the item level. And I think that one of the really benefits for thinking about a collection this way is that it also helps to preserve context. And as we know, context is everything in an archival collection. Just a kind of a quick example of something I found in one of my collections. I had the opportunity to process the papers of Congresswoman Patsy Mink from Hawaii. And so I was going through the collection and came across in a file a newspaper clipping about some of her activities before she was elected to Congress. And I thought, great, this is a really wonderful source. It belongs with her pre-congressional papers. This makes sense. But then I looked more closely at the folder where it was located. And it actually turns out that this was part of material that she got through a FOIA request in 1976, after she had been in Congress for almost 12 years. It was that year that she learned that the FBI and the CIA had kept files on her dating back to her early political activities. And if I had removed that clipping, if I had thought about it the way so many novices do, where they reach in a box, pull out an item, and say, what do I do with this? I would have stripped it of layers of meaning.
Okay, the next step is actually examining the collection. And of course, we begin to think about arrangement when we're reviewing accession records and box lists, but it's at this stage when we actually look at the stuff that we begin to grapple with arrangement in a concrete way.
Okay, first thing we do, only because we've been bitten before, is we try to make sure that we have the entire collection. It's happened to each one of us in the manuscript division. We spend a good chunk of our careers processing a collection. We write an absolutely fabulous finding aid. We have a sense of peace and closure. And then a year later, someone comes and says, a box strayed from the collection before processing. And now we have to deal with it. So to the extent possible, make sure you've got the entire collection.
In some ways, we're approaching a collection like an archaeologist or detective would. We're looking for clues. We're not going to disturb the order at this point until we have a better handle on the collection. But we're being observant. We're going to take notes on what we see.
Okay, so this is the initial review of the collection when you're first dealing with the physical stuff. The first thing you're dealing with are boxes. No, I'm sorry. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Okay, this is our first survey, and we're being observant. We're being archaeologists. But exactly what are we looking for? What are we trying to find? What I find is that what I'm looking for are the longest, most identifiable runs of like material. Okay, this presupposes the collection isn't a total mess. But I'm looking through the boxes, and I come across, for instance, a box of correspondence, an alphabetical file, D through E. And I think, wow, this is great. You know, I can already see a correspondence series. And then I continue looking for the rest of that alphabetical file. Then I come across another box, and it's a box of speeches. I have a possible second series, a speech file. Things are beginning to look really good. Then I come across a box. I open it up. Nothing is foldered. Nothing relates to anything else in that box. It spans 50 years in time. I can't make heads or tails of it. It doesn't make sense to me. And every instinct I have at that moment tells me that that box needs my attention, that it needs me to stop what I'm doing and pay attention to it. And I've learned actually to discipline myself and not to do that. I take a few notes on its contents, and then I continue to look for my runs of like material, because it's those runs of like material that are going to be the building blocks for my organization. So basically, think about it this way. This is like playing gin rummy. You've been dealt your hand of cards, and what's the first thing you do? You organize suits or possible suits. What do you do with the stray cards? You put them at the end of the hand. So look for those runs of like material, begin to get a sense of how your organization of your collection is going to shape up, and then only at the end deal with those odd fits.
And it's because identifying these runs of material is identifying the original order. Original order does not mean keep everything exactly, every little item exactly in its place. Say as you find 9 boxes of speech files, often within those files, everything's a mess. But the fact that you're keeping those 9 boxes together, that's adhering to original order.
And that's where we really kind of get to the truth about original order, the title of this talk. Original order is rarely pristine. Material is misfiled. Filing systems are inconsistent. And as Laura said, things are rarely filed down to the item level. And one serious question you have as an archivist is, do you have the staff time to correct those mistakes and those errors? Or do you have to live with it as it is?
But it is true that original order maintaining it is still the best practice. There's evidential value in how a collection was created and how it was used. And it's actually labor saving for us because the material just sort of fits together better than if you're trying to figure out an order and impose one on it.
Okay, so I'm being an archaeologist, and I'm beginning to look at my collection. If I'm lucky enough to have an inventory, and rarely am I ever that lucky, then I'm able to sit at my desk and intellectually organize that collection without lifting a heavy box. But most often, the first thing I'm actually dealing with and encountering are the boxes themselves. And what I'm looking for is meaningful labels. And this is about as good as it ever gets as an archivist. I think you all appreciate that. This label tells me that this is from the papers of Congresswoman Patsy Mink. It tells me that these are Hawaii issue files for the year 1999. It tells me that there are 29 boxes of these issue files, and that this is box 21 within that sequence. This is really, really good. But then I was continued surveying the collection, and lo and behold, I found a whole nother set of Hawaii issue files for exactly the same year. And had to, at this point, figure out, why do I have two sets of these files? And I don't know, I just suddenly took a look at the physical boxes, and I noticed that this label is a bright yellow, the other label was white. And I noticed a similar pattern throughout the collection. And I delved inside and I discovered that the color labels were used by her office in Honolulu, and the white labels were used by her office here on Capitol Hill. So I was able to look out over the whole room and be able to divide those files as they should have been divided originally, into her district office files and her Capitol Hill files. Okay, but you don't always have box labels. So now you're dealing with the physical box. And this also comes from the papers of Patsy Mink. And if you notice, it's a lot older than the other box. Well, it turns out she was in Congress for two stints, from 1965 to 76 when she lost a Senate bid, and then she gets back in office in 1991 in the special election. This older box comes from her first time in Congress. So again, I was able to look out over the whole room and assemble those files. Okay, so you've gotten everything you can possibly get from that box, and you're ready to open it up. You're again looking for labeling on folders. The Democratic Party, this is very nice. And look in the left-hand side of that label. What does it say? H1. And you wonder, as an archivist, does that mean anything? Should I be paying attention to that? Well, I was asking that question, and I soon came across also P1 files and M1 files. Well, H was pretty quickly, I could figure that out pretty easily. H stands for Hawaii. And it turns out this is the Democratic Party of Hawaii. P, personal. It was material related to her personally. M stumped me for the longest time. I'll just throw it out. Anyone, M? Okay, Hawaiians kind of divide the world into Hawaii and mainland. Did you get it? I'm embarrassed to say how long it took me to get that, but it tended to be files of national organizations. But again, you're being observant and you're noting things even if you don't quite understand them yet. So after you've gotten all of the useful labeling done, you're also looking for types of folders. A run of letter size could mean this is a run of material, legal size, those horrible hanging folders that catch on your clothes. And also method of labeling. Is there anything to indicate that this was a file that was maintained together and indicates a run?
Now, as Meg said, while we're looking, we're also going to find those odd bits and bunches of material. I think anybody who's ever processed has come across these to-be-filed folders that then were never filed. And then this was another one I came across, one-of-a-kind stuff. Now, I mean, that's not that useful of a label, and it also wasn't all that one of a kind. And then one of my all-time favorites, second pile on couch. Now, at this point, we're just going to take notes, and we'll ultimately see, when we know more about the rest of the collection, how these things fit in. But second pile on couch is going to be useful to nobody, so it's, I ended up filing that stuff where it actually belonged. Yeah, well, it was on the couch till I got to here. We didn't have a couch. Now, when you have no order, as we've showed before, then, to get going, you have to impose an order. And so we have to create series. And so we usually do it based on a person's life and career. You might very well have series based on, the different jobs they held, or the type of material you're finding. There could be a correspondence series, or maybe you're finding a subject file or writings. And at some point, you actually have to deal with it. And when we do that, we start with what we call a rough sort. You make piles. You put like things together. And as you're finding clues, you might match up letterhead or type of stationery or handwriting. But sometimes, this is our colleague Connie with the mask and the gloves, you end up having to piece together documents or even pages from documents. This was a collection of a 19th century physician, and it was found in a barn. So the dirt and the smell is something else that she has to deal with at this point.
Okay, decision making. How do we as archivists make these decisions about whether to adhere to our original order or whether to impose an order? When do we go with fine-tuned processing, and when do we go with the more product, less process, streamlined approach? Well, we like to draw inspiration from our collections. This couple, they're Charles and Ray Eames, who were mid-century American designers, best known for their chair designs. And they were asked to participate in an exhibit in Paris in 1969 called What is Design? And where they were asked to present their approach to design work. Well, Charles Eames dashed off this diagram that looks like he did it on a napkin at a Paris cafe. It actually went through 39 drafts to get that look of spontaneity. But this is how he explained how he approaches design work. Overlapping spheres. One represents the interest of the client, obviously, which has to be taken into account. The other sphere represents the interest of his design office, because after all, his office has a stake in the work they do. And I love the fact that he included a larger circle representing the interest of society, because they argued they were designing more than just for one client. They were designing for society at large. And Charles argued that it's where these spheres overlap in the center, that is where he works as a designer. That is where he works with conviction and enthusiasm. So Laura and I are less artistic, and so we have overlapping rectangles.
But we have concerns and interests that we deal with too. And one of them on the lower left-hand side are the interests of the archival profession. That is, the best practices, such as maintaining original order and respecting provenance.
And then in the upper left-hand side is the collection. And all of those problems is presenting you with donor-imposed restrictions, conservation nightmares, foreign language material, born digital, all these things crying out for your attention.
Okay, on the lower right-hand side are the interests of the researchers. How do you think a researcher is going to use a collection? What are they going to be most interested in? And where this sometimes comes into play is with correspondence, especially if you've got big piles of unsorted correspondence. If a person knew a lot of famous people, then it's likely researchers are going to come wanting to see letters of specific people. So an arrangement that is alphabetical by the correspondent is helpful for them. But it can be some kind of a problem for us sometimes, because people who know each other don't write their last names, or they just use nicknames, and you've got to figure out who Bill is or who Bubbles is. But if a person didn't know famous people, or if they are more going to be interested in a time period, say like the Civil War or the Great Depression, then a chronological arrangement would be best for them. And it can be easier for us. I mean, there's still problems because not everybody dates their letters, or they write letters so often that they just write Thursday. But there are things that can help you. If they're still in envelopes, well then postmarks are great because they give you a date. Sometimes if a person wrote frequently and they used the same stationery, or they have the same pen, then you can figure it was probably written about the same time as those other materials. And sometimes just the content of the letters can give you some clue as to the time frame of a letter.
And then finally, in the upper right-hand corner is your repository, and taking into account the resources that you have. And this is something we're all dealing with, particularly budget constraints and staffing constraints. So we have to think about what our staffing levels are and who's working on the collection. Are we having to rely on interns or volunteers who may be brand new to the archival profession? What is space constraints? Do we ever have enough space? We never do. And so it can be really hard processing a large collection with no space. And your budget for conservation supplies. But I think that what Laura and I really want to convey with this diagram is that you as the archivist are making decisions, weighing each one of these 4 factors. It's going to differ between collections. It's probably also going to differ within the collection, between different series. There's some series that are going to warrant much more of your effort and time. Other series, not so much. And I think that what we want to convey is that, kind of know at the end that you weighed all these factors, you made the best possible decision, and to be at peace with that decision.
Now, from all we've said, it might sound like we operate in a vacuum, but we don't. This is the government, so there's paperwork. Once we have devised our arrangement scheme, how we think we're going to organize the collection, we prepare what we call a processing proposal. And in this document, we lay out our proposed arrangement scheme, and we raise issues we found as we've been looking through the collection. There may be some odd conservation issue that you're going to have to deal with. And we also raise questions that we have, things we might need help with in dealing with the collection. And we propose a time frame for completion. Then we send it out for comments and approval. But I thought I'd show you some of the things that I've discovered in recent collections that I had to raise in my proposal. I think more and more we're dealing with, yeah, 5¼ inch discs or electronic records of all kinds.
We've even had 8-inch discs.
Yeah, and we are working. We've come through up with workflows for dealing with electronic records. But one of the things they say is, as soon as you know that you've got some things you're going to have to deal with, let people know. So a proposal is a good place to let people know. Now, this was another collection. I had a whole run of this sort of odd-shaped documents, and it turns out that this person composed, they wrote using the cut and paste method, the old-fashioned cut and paste method, not like the computer, where they cut up drafts and they tape them together. And there's all kinds of problems with, you can see, this is oddly shaped, so it's being torn. There's acidic paper, and the tape, I think you can see that some of the red ink is blurring. That's because the adhesive is leached out and it's blurring the ink. But other times, the adhesive just dries up, the tape goes off, and the pieces fall out. So, one of the concerns I had to think about was, how valuable is this? How much time do I have to deal with it? So I raised this whole problem in my proposal. Now, in another collection I had, a person had 40 years worth of diaries, and they loved to stick things in their diaries. And you can see in this page, they were sticking newspaper clippings, and the acidic paper has already stained the diary. And we just can't keep loose things in volumes, because as they're being used by researchers, all the stuff's going to fall out, and then you won't know where it belongs. So that is an issue that had to be dealt with. I worked on the papers of a old-time movie pioneering director and stage director. And it turned out that he liked to press flowers, and he pressed flowers in everything. But I had come across articles that said that he liked to make art with them, and he actually got some publicity about doing this. So I want to document the fact that he liked to press flowers, but you can't keep organic material in with documents, so that had to be dealt with. Another thing that I absolutely did not know before I started about this guy is when he died, there were 40 cats in the house. And I am sad to say that that is cat urine. And so I had lots of questions that I raised, is this a health hazard? Conservation, how do you deal with this? And so I raised it, and then after the proposal, I ended up talking about urine with more people than I ever had before in my whole life.
It's funny. I came from a small repository. It was a university special collections and archives. We never wrote proposals. We would shout across the room and tell each other what we planned to do. But I've become a real advocate for it, even if you're in a small repository. And I think there are a number of advantages. One, if you have an ever-shifting processing team and you're getting new people on board all the time, it's a really great way to bring people up to speed on what's being done with the collection. Secondly, it serves as a for-the-record document explaining the decisions that were made. This collection that you think you're never, ever going to forget, 15 years from now, you're not going to remember you even touched it, much less the decisions that you made. Laura and I worked on a collection, the papers of Zbigniew Brzezinski, And
It was additions. I did
Yeah.
the first part, she
And-
did the second part.
I had lots of questions for Laura about why she made certain decisions.
And I didn't really remember why, but, you know, reading through my proposal, it jogged my memory as to why certain things were done certain ways.
And we've kind of come to terms with the fact that we may not always be at the Library of Congress. And so for our predecessor, you know, it's a permanent record. But I also find for me as an archivist, it's really important that I find that it makes me account for the things I need to account for. But also, if I'm spending too many words explaining what I want to do with the collection, to me that's a red flag that I'm making things too complicated. And I think that all of us, when we start out in this profession, definitely make things too complicated. And that as we go on and get more experience, we greatly streamline and simplify what we do.
Now, I want to leave with an ending thought, and that is that Meg and I have both done this work for about 25 years. But every time we get a new collection, especially if it's big and messy, I say to myself, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this one. I know I've done it before, but this is the one that's going to break me. But that's the director. But every time, at least so far, we end up with boxes filled with nicely folded material that ends up in archive boxes with labels. And I want to say that, as a bit of closure, that these boxes are the contents of that trash can, of those trash cans. So we're done. Any questions?
Do we